One of my twin sons was slowly poisoning me, but I didn't know which one. For 3 months I'd been getting sicker and weaker, while both Paul and Peter visited me daily, bringing meals, checking on my health, acting like devoted sons. But when I finally discovered what was really happening, I realized that one of them wasn't trying to care for me. He was trying to kill me. At 72 years old, I thought I knew my boys. Paul and Peter had been inseparable since birth, identical twins who looked so alike that even I sometimes had trouble telling them apart when they were children. Now they were 45, both successful in their own ways, both married with families, both seemingly concerned about their aging father's well-being. But someone was putting poison in my food, and it had to be one of them. My name is Robert Harrison, and this is the story of how I discovered that one of my sons was willing to commit murder for money. While the other was an innocent man I almost lost forever, the illness started gradually, so subtly that I didn't recognize it as anything more than the normal decline of old age. It began with fatigue that seemed more severe than usual, a bone-deep tiredness that didn't improve with rest. Then came the nausea, waves of sickness that struck without warning, usually in the evenings after dinner. My doctor, Patricia Chen, ran every test she could think of. Blood work, scans, comprehensive physical examinations. Everything came back within normal ranges for a man my age. "Robert, you're actually in remarkable health for 72, she told me during one of our appointments. Your heart is strong, your blood pressure is good, no signs of cancer or organ failure. This might just be a particularly stubborn virus that's taking time to work its way out of your system." But I knew my body, and this wasn't a virus. Something was systematically making me sick, and it was getting worse with each passing week. The first clue came on a Tuesday evening in October. Paul had brought me dinner from my favorite Italian restaurant, chicken parmesan with pasta, the same meal I'd been ordering there for 20 years. But within an hour of eating, I was violently ill, sicker than I'd ever been in my adult life. Paul rushed me to the emergency room, genuinely panicked, holding my hand while the doctors ran tests and pumped my stomach. His concern seemed completely authentic, his fear for my well-being absolutely real. "Dad, you scared me to death," he said as we waited for the test results. "I thought I was losing you. The emergency room doctor couldn't find anything wrong with the food or with me. Sometimes our digestive systems become more sensitive as we age," she explained. "You might need to avoid rich foods for a while." But the next evening, Peter brought me a simple meal he'd prepared himself, grilled chicken with rice, bland and easy to digest. Within 2 hours I was sick again, though not as severely as the night before. Peter was just as concerned as Paul had been, just as attentive and worried. He stayed with me through the night, checking my temperature, making sure I stayed hydrated, calling the doctor first thing in the morning. "Maybe you're developing food allergies," Peter suggested. "Or maybe your medications are causing stomach problems." Both explanations seemed reasonable. Both sons seemed genuinely worried about my health. But deep in my gut, the part that wasn't constantly nauseous, I knew something wasn't right. The pattern continued for weeks. One son would bring me food. I'd become ill and that son would care for me with apparent devotion. Then the other son would bring different food. I'd get sick again and he'd show the same level of concern and attention. Paul and Peter had always been competitive with each other, even as children. They'd competed for my attention, for their mother's affection, for grades in school, for success in their careers. But they'd also been fiercely protective of each other and of our family. The idea that one of them might be trying to hurt me seemed impossible, but the evidence was mounting. 3 weeks after the restaurant incident, I made a decision that would change everything. I started keeping a detailed journal of when I ate, what I ate, who had provided the food, and how sick I became afterward. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its clarity. When I ate food that Paul brought me, I became moderately ill, nauseous, weak, sometimes with stomach cramps that lasted for hours. When I ate food from Peter, I became severely ill, vomiting, dizziness, sometimes so sick I could barely stand. But the doses seemed inconsistent, as if whoever was doing this was experimenting with amounts, trying to find the right balance between making me sick and killing me outright. The realization that one of my sons was poisoning me hit me like a physical blow. I sat in my study at 2 a.m., looking at weeks of documented evidence, and felt my world collapse around me. One of the two people I trusted most in the world was systematically trying to murder me. But which one? Paul was the more aggressive of the twins, the one who'd always pushed harder for what he wanted. He was a successful real estate developer, but I knew his business had been struggling lately. His wife Jennifer had expensive tastes, and their two teenage children were approaching college age. Money was tight, and Paul had asked me several times about my will, about my plans for dividing my assets. Peter, on the other hand, was gentler by nature, but arguably more cunning. He was a financial advisor who managed investments for wealthy clients, including some of my own portfolio. He understood money, understood the value of my estate, and had intimate knowledge of my financial situation. His wife Linda was more practical than Jennifer, but they also had two children and a mortgage on an expensive house in the best school district. Both sons had motive. Both had opportunity. Both seemed equally concerned about my welfare when I was sick. The thought that kept me awake at night was even more disturbing. If one of them was willing to kill me, what would he do to his brother when it came time to divide the inheritance? My estate was worth approximately $3.2 million. The house, investments, life insurance, and a small business I'd sold 5 years earlier. According to my current will, Paul and Peter would split everything equally after my death. But if one brother died before me, or died shortly after me under suspicious circumstances, the surviving son would inherit everything. I was looking at a double murder plot. The next day, I called my lawyer, Harold Brennan, and scheduled an urgent appointment. "Harold, I need to ask you a hypothetical question," I said when we met that afternoon. "If someone were trying to poison me, how would I prove it?" Harold had been my attorney for 15 years, and his expression immediately became serious. "Robert, this isn't hypothetical, is it?" "I don't know yet, but I need to understand my options. First, you'd need medical evidence. If someone is poisoning you, there should be traces in your system that can be detected through specialized tests. Second, you'd need proof of how the poison is being administered. Contaminated food or drinks, access to your medications, that sort of thing. What if I can't tell who's doing it?" Harold leaned back in his chair, studying my face. "Robert, who do you suspect?" "That's the problem. I suspect everyone and no one at the same time." I told him about my symptoms, about the pattern I'd documented, about my suspicions regarding Paul and Peter. Harold listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad. "This is serious," he said when I finished. "If you're right, you're not just dealing with attempted murder. You're potentially looking at a conspiracy that could extend to multiple victims." "Multiple victims?" "Think about it, Robert. If one of your sons is willing to poison you for inheritance money, what makes you think he'd stop there? The surviving son would inherit everything, but only if he's the only surviving son. The implication made my blood run cold. One of my boys wasn't just planning to kill me, he was planning to kill his brother too. What do you recommend?" "First, we get you medical proof. I know a toxicologist who can run comprehensive tests that will detect almost any poison or drug. Second, we set up surveillance. If someone is contaminating your food, we need to catch them in the act. Surveillance in my own home. Robert, if I'm right about what's happening here, your home is a crime scene. We need to document everything before whoever is doing this decides to escalate their timeline." That evening, I sat in my living room looking at Paul and Peter, who had both come over for our weekly family dinner. They sat on opposite ends of my couch, chatting about their work, their families, their plans for the upcoming holidays. They looked so normal, so familiar, so much like the little boys I'd raised from birth. One of them was a murderer. Paul had brought wine, a bottle of my favorite Cabernet that he'd picked up from the liquor store on his way over. Peter had prepared the meal, beef stew with vegetables, comfort food that reminded me of their mother's cooking. I watched them carefully as we ate, looking for any sign of guilt, any tell that might reveal which one was the killer. But they both seemed relaxed, natural, genuinely enjoying our family time together. "Dad, you look tired," Peter said, reaching over to feel my forehead. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just a little under the weather," I replied, noting that Peter's concern seemed completely authentic. "Maybe you should see Dr. Chen again," Paul suggested. "This has been going on too long. Maybe she missed something in the tests." Paul's suggestion was reasonable, his worry apparent in his voice and expression. As the evening wore on, both sons helped clean up. Both kissed my cheek when they left. Both promised to check on me the next day. If one of them was slowly killing me, he was a better actor than anyone had a right to be. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life had come to this. 45 years ago I'd held 2 tiny babies in my arms, marveling at how identical they were, how perfect they seemed. I'd raised them as a single father after their mother died when they were 12, sacrificing my own social life and career advancement to make sure they had everything they needed. I'd been so proud of the men they'd become, so grateful to have 2 sons who seemed to genuinely care about me in my old age. Most of my friends complained about children who never called, who were too busy with their own lives to visit their aging parents. I'd thought I was blessed to have Paul and Peter, both of whom visited regularly, brought me food, checked on my health, included me in their family activities. Now I knew that one of them saw me as an obstacle to be removed, a source of money that was taking too long to access. The next morning, I called Harold and told him to set up the toxicology tests and the surveillance equipment. "We're going to catch whoever is doing this," he assured me. "But Robert, you need to be prepared for what we might find. If one of your sons is poisoning you, the emotional impact of that discovery might be as devastating as the physical impact of the poison. I need to know the truth, Harold. Whatever it costs me emotionally, I have to know which of my boys is trying to kill me. And what will you do when you find out?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I'll make sure he faces justice. And I'll make sure his brother stays alive. Because if Harold was right, proving which son was poisoning me was only the beginning. The real challenge would be stopping him before he killed us both. The war for my life and Peter or Paul's life was about to begin." The toxicology results came back positive for arsenic. Not enough to kill me quickly, but enough to slowly destroy my organs over months of careful administration. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the toxicologist Harold had recommended, delivered the news with grim professionalism. "Mr. Harrison, you have chronic arsenic poisoning," she said, showing me the test results. "The levels in your system indicate this has been happening for approximately 3 months, with doses administered roughly every other day." 3 months. That aligned perfectly with when my mysterious illness had begun. How is it being given to me? Most likely through food or beverages. Arsenic is tasteless and dissolves easily in liquids. Someone with access to your meals has been systematically poisoning you. The confirmation of what I'd suspected should have brought relief. Instead, I felt sick in an entirely different way. One of my sons, one of the babies I'd held in my arms, one of the boys I'd taught to ride bicycles and throw baseballs, was slowly murdering me. "Doctor, how long do I have if this continues?" "At the current rate of poisoning, 3 to 6 months before organ failure becomes irreversible. But Mr. Harrison, now that we know what's happening, we can start chelation therapy to remove the arsenic from your system." Harold had been right about needing surveillance equipment. The next morning, a team of technicians installed hidden cameras throughout my house, in the kitchen, dining room, living room, and even my bedroom. The cameras were so small and well concealed that even I had trouble spotting them once they were in place. "The system will record everything," the lead technician explained. "Motion-activated night vision capable with audio pickup. Whatever is happening in your house, we'll catch it." That afternoon, I sat in my study reviewing everything I knew about Paul and Peter, trying to find clues that might point to which one was the killer. Paul had always been the more impulsive twin, quick to anger, but also quick to forgive. He'd been the athlete in high school, the risk-taker, the one who acted first and thought later. His real estate business had been hit hard by the recent economic downturn, and I knew he'd had to lay off several employees. His wife Jennifer had expensive tastes, designer clothes, luxury vacations, a house that was probably beyond their means. But Paul had also been the more openly affectionate of my sons. He still hugged me every time he saw me, still called me Dad instead of the more formal father that Peter had adopted. When their mother died, Paul had cried openly at the funeral, while Peter had maintained stoic composure. Peter was the analytical twin, careful and methodical in everything he did. He'd been the academic achiever, the one who planned every move 3 steps ahead. His financial advisory business was thriving, but I knew that success came with pressure. Many of his clients were demanding, and Peter had always been a perfectionist who took professional failures personally. Peter's relationship with me was more formal, but no less caring. He showed his love through actions rather than words, making sure I had groceries, handling my investments, remembering important dates. His wife Linda was practical and frugal, and their children were well-behaved and studious. On paper, Paul seemed like the more likely suspect. He needed money, he was impulsive, and his emotional nature might make him more likely to take drastic action. But Peter had the patience for a slow poisoning scheme, and his financial expertise would make him more aware of exactly how much my death would benefit him. The first test came 3 days later. Paul arrived at 6 p.m. with takeout from a Chinese restaurant, sweet and sour chicken, fried rice and egg rolls. He seemed relaxed and cheerful, talking about his daughter's soccer game and his son's college applications. "Dad, you look better," he said as we ate. "More color in your cheeks. Are you feeling stronger?" I was feeling stronger, thanks to the chelation therapy Dr. Mitchell had started. But I couldn't tell Paul that without revealing what I knew. "I think I'm getting over whatever this bug was," I said carefully. "Good. You had us all scared for a while there." I watched Paul throughout the meal, looking for any sign of guilty knowledge, any indication that he knew exactly why I'd been sick. His behavior seemed completely normal, his concern apparently genuine. But 2 hours after eating, I felt the familiar nausea beginning. Not as severe as it had been before I started chelation therapy, but unmistakable. The hidden cameras captured everything. Paul serving the food, both of us eating. My gradual decline into illness. The next evening, Peter brought homemade lasagna that Linda had prepared. Like Paul, he seemed relaxed and natural, chatting about his work and asking about my health. "I've been worried about you," Peter said as we shared the meal. "Those episodes you've been having don't seem normal for your age. Maybe we should get a second opinion from a specialist." Peter's suggestion was reasonable, his manner concerned but not overly anxious. If he was the one poisoning me, he was remarkably composed about it. Again, I became ill several hours after eating, though the symptoms were more severe than they'd been with Paul's food. The cameras captured every moment of Peter's visit, every interaction, every opportunity he might have had to contaminate the food. But reviewing the footage later with Harold, we couldn't see any obvious moment when either son had done anything suspicious. Both had helped serve the food, both had eaten the same meals themselves, both had shown appropriate concern when I became sick. "Whoever is doing this is very careful," Harold observed. "They're not contaminating the food during the visit itself. It's happening before they arrive, so the poisoning is premeditated, not impulsive." Exactly. This isn't someone acting in the heat of the moment. This is a calculated long-term murder plot. That observation pointed more toward Peter's methodical nature than Paul's impulsive personality. But it wasn't proof. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later. During what should have been a routine family gathering, both Paul and Peter had come over for Sunday dinner, bringing their wives and children for our monthly family meal. It was a tradition we'd maintained since their mother's death, a way of keeping the extended family connected. I watched the interaction between my sons carefully, looking for any sign of tension or competition that might reveal the truth about what was happening. What I saw was more disturbing than I'd expected. Paul and Peter were engaged in what looked like a subtle but intense rivalry, each trying to position himself as the more devoted son. Paul insisted on carving the roast, claiming he wanted to help his old man with the heavy lifting. Peter took over serving the vegetables, making sure everyone had exactly what they needed. Both sons were overly attentive to my needs, refilling my water glass, asking if I was comfortable, offering to adjust the temperature. To an outside observer, it might have looked like loving care. But knowing what I knew, it felt like a performance. "Dad," Paul said during dessert, "Jennifer and I have been talking about maybe taking a family vacation this summer. Somewhere special, while we still have you with us." The phrase, "while we still have you with us," could have been innocent acknowledgement of my age, or it could have been something more sinister. "That sounds wonderful," I replied carefully. "Maybe we could all go together," Peter suggested. "Linda loves planning trips, and the kids would enjoy spending time with their grandfather." "That would be nice," I said, noting how Peter had emphasized the word grandfather, as if reminding everyone of our relationship. But the real revelation came when I excused myself to go to the bathroom. The hidden cameras in my study captured a conversation between Paul and Peter that changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. He's looking better, Paul said quietly. Yeah, I noticed that too, stronger. Do you think he's getting medical treatment we don't know about? Peter was quiet for a moment. It's possible. Dad's always been secretive about his health. We might need to accelerate our timeline. I agree, but we have to be careful. If anything looks suspicious, I know, but we can't wait much longer. Harold and I reviewed that footage dozens of times, analyzing every word, every inflection, every gesture. The conversation seemed to confirm that both sons were involved in whatever was happening to me. But there was something about the exchange that bothered me, something I couldn't quite identify. Harold, listen to this part again, I said, replaying the section where Peter talked about being careful. We have to be careful. If anything looks suspicious, what are you thinking? Harold asked. The way Peter says if anything looks suspicious, it sounds like he's worried about getting caught. But caught doing what? If they're both in on the poisoning, what would look suspicious? Maybe they're planning to escalate from poisoning to something more direct. Or maybe, I paused, a terrible thought forming in my mind. Maybe they're not working together. Maybe they're working against each other. Harold looked confused. What do you mean? What if one son is poisoning me, and the other son knows about it but is planning something different? What if the timeline they're talking about isn't about killing me, it's about stopping the killer? The possibility that one of my sons might be trying to protect me while the other was trying to murder me was almost too complex to process. But it would explain the inconsistent poisoning doses, the different levels of severity in my reactions to food from each son. Robert, that's a lot of speculation based on one ambiguous conversation. Then we need more evidence. We need to catch one of them in the act. That's when I made a decision that Harold strongly advised against. I was going to set up a trap that would force the killer to reveal himself. I'm going to tell both sons that I've updated my will, I announced. Robert, that's incredibly dangerous. If one of them is already trying to kill you, giving them more motivation could get you murdered before we can prove anything. Not more motivation, Harold. More desperation. If I tell them the will has been changed in a way that affects their inheritance, the killer will have to act quickly to stop me from finalizing it. And if they both decide to kill you immediately, then at least we'll know they were working together. The plan was risky, but I was tired of being a victim. For 3 months, someone had been slowly poisoning me, treating me like an obstacle to be removed rather than a father to be loved. I wanted to know which son saw me as nothing more than a source of money. More importantly, I wanted to know which son still saw me as his father. The next evening, I called both Paul and Peter and asked them to come over for an important family discussion. Is everything okay, Dad? Paul asked when he arrived first. We'll talk when your brother gets here. Peter arrived 15 minutes later, apologizing for being stuck in traffic. Both sons sat on my living room couch, looking concerned and attentive. Boys, I began, I need to tell you something important about my estate planning. Both sons leaned forward slightly, their attention focused completely on my words. I've decided to make some changes to my will. The reaction from both sons was immediate and revealing, though not in the way I'd expected. I've decided to make some changes to my will, I announced to my twin sons, watching their faces carefully for any telltale reactions. Paul's expression immediately became tense, his jaw tightening slightly. What kind of changes, Dad? Peter leaned back against the couch, his face remaining neutral but his eyes sharpening with interest. Is this about your health? Are you worried about something specific? Not worried, just being practical, I said, settling into my chair across from them. At 72, a man needs to make sure his affairs are in order. Both sons nodded, but I could see the difference in their body language. Paul looked genuinely concerned, perhaps even anxious about what I might say. Peter appeared curious but composed, like a financial advisor listening to a client's investment concerns. The thing is, I continued, I've been thinking about fairness, about making sure my estate goes to the son who needs it most and deserves it most. That got both their attention. Paul actually leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Peter's composed expression flickered for just a moment. Dad, Paul said carefully, you know Peter and I have never competed over your money. We both just want you to be happy and healthy. Of course, Peter agreed smoothly. Whatever you decide will be fine with both of us. Right, Paul. Paul nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Right, but Dad, you're not thinking about this because you feel sick again, are you? Because if you are, maybe we should talk to Dr. Chen about running more tests. Interesting. Paul seemed more concerned about my health than about potential changes to my inheritance. Peter, meanwhile, was watching me with the calculating expression I'd seen him use when analyzing investment portfolios. I'm feeling fine, I lied. Better than I have in months, actually. That's why I think now is the perfect time to make these decisions while my mind is clear. What specific changes are you considering? Peter asked, his tone professional and controlled. Here was the moment of truth. The lie I was about to tell would either reveal which son was poisoning me, or potentially get me killed faster if I'd misjudged the situation. I've decided to leave everything to whichever son is still alive when I die. The silence that followed was deafening. Both Paul and Peter stared at me, processing what I'd just said. Dad, that's... Paul began, then stopped. That's a horrible thing to say. We're both healthy. We're both going to outlive you by decades. I hope so, I said. But life is unpredictable. Accidents happen. People get sick. I want to make sure my estate goes to the son who's actually around to benefit from it. Peter was very quiet, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications of what I'd proposed. Finally, he spoke. Father, that kind of arrangement creates perverse incentives. If one of us died unexpectedly, the other would inherit everything. It might make people suspicious about the circumstances of the death. Suspicious of what? I asked innocently. Of foul play. Of the surviving son having a motive for murder. Paul looked at his brother with something approaching horror. Jesus, Peter, what kind of thing is that to say? You think I'd kill you for money? I don't think anything, Peter replied calmly. I'm just pointing out that Dad's proposed arrangement could create legal complications if either of us died under questionable circumstances. Legal complications, Paul repeated, his voice rising. You're talking about legal complications when Dad just told us he's planning to pit us against each other, like gladiators fighting for his money. I watched this exchange with fascination. Paul seemed genuinely upset by the moral implications of my proposal. Peter seemed more concerned about the practical and legal ramifications. It's not pitting you against each other, I said. It's just acknowledging reality. Only one of you will be alive to need the money when I'm gone. But Dad, Paul said, what if we're both alive? What if we both outlive you by 30 years? Then what happens? I hadn't thought through that aspect of my fictional will change, and I scrambled for an answer. Well, in that case, you'd split everything equally, like the current will says. So you're essentially creating a death lottery, Peter observed. If we both survive you, we split the inheritance. But if one of us dies first, the survivor gets everything. That's one way to look at it. Peter was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking through all the angles. Paul, meanwhile, seemed genuinely distressed by the entire conversation. Dad, I don't like this, Paul said finally. I don't want to spend the rest of your life wondering if my brother is going to push me down the stairs to get his hands on your money. And I don't want to spend it wondering if my brother is going to poison my food, Peter replied quietly. The room went dead silent. Paul stared at Peter with his mouth open. I felt my heart stop beating for a moment. What did you just say? Paul whispered. Peter looked directly at his brother, his expression unreadable. I said I don't want to worry about you poisoning my food. Why would you say that? Why would poisoning even occur to you? Because someone has been poisoning Dad. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Paul's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, shock, and then dawning horror. Someone's been poisoning Dad. Paul turned to look at me. Dad, is that true? I looked at Peter, who was still staring at his brother with those calculating eyes. How do you know someone's been poisoning me, Peter? Because I've been watching you get sicker after every meal Paul brings you. And because I've been keeping track of your symptoms. Paul jumped to his feet. You think I've been poisoning Dad? Haven't you? No, Jesus Christ, no. How could you even think that? Because you need the money more than I do. Your business is failing, your wife is demanding, and your kids are expensive. You have motive, and you don't. Paul shot back. You manage rich people's money all day long, watching them live the kind of life you can only dream about. Don't tell me you don't want more. I watched this exchange with growing unease. Either I was witnessing an Oscar-worthy performance by one of my sons, or I had completely misunderstood the situation. Peter, I said carefully, if you suspected Paul was poisoning me, why didn't you say anything sooner? Because I wanted to be sure. And because I wanted to catch him in the act. Catch me in the act of what? Paul demanded. Peter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small bottle. This is activated charcoal. I've been putting it in Dad's food every time I cook for him. It absorbs toxins and prevents them from being fully absorbed into the bloodstream. I stared at the bottle, my mind reeling. You've been putting activated charcoal in my food? It's harmless, Peter said quickly. It's actually used medically to treat poisoning. I've been trying to protect you while gathering evidence against Paul. Paul sank back down onto the couch, his face pale. Evidence of what? I haven't done anything. Then why has Dad gotten sicker every time he eats food you bring him, but less sick when he eats food I prepare? I don't know. Maybe he's allergic to something I've been bringing. Maybe it's the restaurants I choose. There could be 100 explanations that don't involve me trying to murder my own father. I looked back and forth between my sons, trying to process what I was hearing. If Peter was telling the truth, he'd been trying to protect me, not poison me. But that would mean, Peter, I said slowly, if you've been putting activated charcoal in my food to protect me from poison, and I still got sick after eating it, what does that tell us? Peter's composed expression finally cracked. It tells us the poison isn't being administered through the food I prepare, which means Paul has been poisoning you through some other method, or what? Peter looked directly at me, and I saw fear in his eyes for the first time. Or someone else has access to your food and your home. The implication hit all three of us simultaneously. If Peter had been trying to protect me, and Paul wasn't poisoning me, then someone else entirely was trying to kill me. Who else has access to this house? Paul asked, his voice tight with concern. I thought about it. You too, obviously. Harold comes by sometimes. Dr. Chen has made a few house calls. The housekeeper comes twice a week. Mrs. Rodriguez has been cleaning for you for 10 years, Peter said. Why would she suddenly start poisoning you? What about Dr. Chen? Paul suggested. She's been treating you for these symptoms. Maybe she's causing them. That doesn't make sense, I said. She's been trying to help me figure out what's wrong. Has she? Peter asked quietly. Or has she been managing your symptoms to keep you sick but not dead? The thought was chilling, but it didn't feel right. Dr. Chen had seemed genuinely puzzled by my illness. I genuinely concerned about my health. There's another possibility, Paul said, his voice barely above a whisper. What? What if one of us is poisoning Dad without knowing it? Peter and I both stared at him.
What do you mean?
I mean, what if someone is using one of us to deliver the poison? What if they're contaminating food before we bring it to Dad, knowing we'll be blamed? The idea was diabolical, but it made a horrible kind of sense. Someone could be using Paul and me as unwitting accomplices in my own murder, knowing that suspicion would fall on us rather than on them. Who would do something like that? I asked. Someone who benefits from your death but doesn't want to be directly involved, Peter said, his financial advisor training kicking in. Someone who stands to inherit if both Paul and I are convicted of murder. But that would be... I stopped, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Who, Dad? Paul asked urgently. My sister Eleanor. If both of you were convicted of murdering me, she'd be my next of kin. She'd inherit everything. Eleanor was my younger sister, a woman I'd never been particularly close to, but who had always resented what she saw as my greater success in life. She lived about 30 miles away, had never married, had no children, and had always seemed bitter about the way her life had turned out. More importantly, she had a key to my house. Aunt Eleanor? Paul said, sounding stunned. But she barely ever visits. I don't think I've seen her more than 3 times this year. She doesn't need to visit frequently, Peter said, his analytical mind working through the logistics. She just needs access to contaminate things that she knows you'll consume later. Your coffee, your medications, maybe even your toothpaste or shampoo. I thought about the pattern of my poisoning, the seemingly random timing, the way it didn't correlate perfectly with meals from either son. If Eleanor had been sneaking into my house periodically to contaminate household items I used regularly, it would explain the inconsistent dosing. We need to call the police, Paul said. Not yet, Peter said. We need proof. Right now, this is all speculation. Then what do you suggest? Peter looked at both of us, his expression grim but determined. We set a trap. What kind of trap? We tell Eleanor about Dad's new will. We make sure she knows that if both Paul and I are out of the picture, She inherits everything. Then we watch what she does. I looked at my son with new respect. That's dangerous, Peter. If Eleanor is the one poisoning me, telling her about the will change might make her escalate her efforts. Maybe. Or maybe it will make her sloppy. People get careless when they're close to getting what they want. Paul was nodding slowly. And we'll have surveillance set up. If she tries anything, we'll catch her in the act. There's still one problem, I said. If I'm wrong about this, if one of you is actually the killer, then I'm about to make a fatal mistake by trusting you. Both sons looked at me with expressions of hurt and understanding. Dad, Paul said quietly, I know you have to consider that possibility, but I swear to you on Mom's grave that I would never hurt you. Never. And I swear the same thing, Peter added. Whatever our faults, whatever mistakes we've made, we're your sons. We love you. I looked at these two men, these twins who had been the center of my world since their birth, and made a decision that would either save my life or end it. All right. We'll set the trap for Eleanor. But even as I agreed to the plan, a nagging doubt remained in the back of my mind. Peter's explanation was logical, his evidence compelling, his commitment to protecting me apparently genuine. But he was also the more calculating of my sons, the one capable of elaborate long-term planning. What if this was all an incredibly sophisticated manipulation? What if Peter was the killer, and he'd just convinced both Paul and me to help him frame Eleanor? There was only one way to find out. Over the next hour, we planned our trap carefully. I would call Eleanor and tell her about the will change, making sure she understood the implications for her own inheritance. Then we'd wait and see what happened. The hidden cameras were already in place throughout my house. Harold could review the footage and catch Eleanor if she tried to contaminate anything. But we also set up a backup plan. Peter would prepare all my food for the next week, using only ingredients he purchased himself. Paul would handle my medications, ensuring they came directly from the pharmacy with no opportunity for tampering. If I continued to get sick, despite these precautions, we'd know the poison was coming from a source we hadn't considered. There's one more thing, I said, as we finished making our plans. What's that? Paul asked. If this doesn't work, if we can't catch whoever is doing this, I want you both to know that I'm proud of you. Whatever happens, you're good men. You're good sons. Peter's composed expression finally broke completely, and I saw tears in his eyes. Paul was already crying. Dad, nothing's going to happen to you, Paul said fiercely. We won't let it. We'll protect you, Peter added. Whatever it takes. As my sons left that evening, both promising to stay in close contact over the next few days, I reflected on what I'd learned. The dynamic between Paul and Peter wasn't what I'd thought it was. They weren't competing against each other for my inheritance. They were working together to protect me from someone else, or at least, that's what Peter wanted me to believe. The next morning, I called Eleanor. Eleanor, it's Robert. I need to discuss something important with you about my estate planning. Oh? Her voice was carefully neutral. What about it? I've made some changes to my will that affect the entire family. Could you come over this afternoon? I'd like to explain them in person. There was a long pause. Changes that affect me? Potentially, yes. I'll be there at 3 o'clock. After I hung up, I realized that in a few hours, I'd either finally identify the person who was trying to kill me, or I'd discover that one of my sons was an even more skilled manipulator than I'd ever imagined. Either way, the truth was finally going to come out. Eleanor arrived at exactly 3 o'clock, dressed in her usual dark clothing and carrying her oversized black purse. At 68, my sister had the kind of sharp, angular features that made her look perpetually disapproving. She'd never married, never had children, and had spent most of her adult life working as a bookkeeper for various small businesses around town. Robert, she said, giving me a brief hug that felt more like a social obligation than genuine affection. You look better than I expected. Better than you expected. Well, Paul mentioned you'd been having health problems. I was worried you might be, she paused delicately, declining. Paul had mentioned my health problems to Eleanor. That was interesting. I hadn't known they'd been in contact. I'm doing much better, actually. That's part of why I wanted to talk to you today. Eleanor settled into my living room chair, the same chair she'd always chosen during her infrequent visits over the years. She placed her purse on the floor beside her within easy reach. You said this was about your will. Yes, I've made some changes that could potentially affect you. Eleanor's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught a flicker of interest in her eyes. What kind of changes? I repeated the same story I'd told Paul and Peter the day before, about leaving everything to whichever son survived longest. Eleanor listened without interruption, but I noticed her hands tighten slightly on the arms of her chair when I got to the part about the inheritance. Going to the survivor. That's a very unusual arrangement, she said when I finished. Maybe, but it makes sense to me. And if something happened to both Paul and Peter, there it was. The question that revealed her true interest in this conversation. Well, in that case, you'd be my next of kin. The estate would go to you. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if processing this information for the first time, but there was something in her expression that suggested she'd already considered this possibility. Robert, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you told the boys about this change? I told them yesterday. How did they react? About as you'd expect. They were surprised, maybe a little concerned about the implications. I imagine they were. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said something that made my blood run cold. You know, it might be wise to finalize these changes quickly. At our age, you never know what might happen. What do you mean? Just that paperwork can take time, and if something unexpected occurred before the new will was properly executed. She shrugged. Well, it could complicate things. I looked at my sister, this woman I'd known for 70 years, and saw a stranger. The way she was talking about my potential death, the casual mention of something unexpected happening, it all felt calculated, predatory. Eleanor, can I ask you something? Of course. How often have you been coming by the house lately? Her carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment. What do you mean? I mean, have you been stopping by when I wasn't here? Maybe to check on things? Make sure everything was secure? I have a key if that's what you're asking. You gave it to me years ago for emergencies. Have you used it recently? Eleanor was quiet for several seconds, clearly choosing her words carefully. Once or twice when I was worried about you. After Paul told me you'd been sick, I wanted to make sure you had groceries, that your medications were organized properly. When was the last time? I'm not sure. Maybe 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago was right in the middle of my poisoning episodes. If Eleanor had been in my house, she'd have had access to everything. My food, my medications, my personal care items. Did you mention these visits to Paul or Peter? No, I didn't want them to think I was interfering. You know how protective they are of you. I studied Eleanor's face, looking for signs of guilt, nervousness, or deception. What I saw was something more unsettling, a kind of cold calculation, as if she was evaluating how much I suspected and how she should respond. Eleanor, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to give me an honest answer. All right. Have you been putting anything in my food or medications? The question hung in the air between us like an accusation. Eleanor's face went through a series of micro-expressions, surprise, indignation, and something that might have been fear. Robert, what a terrible thing to ask. Why would I hurt you? That's not an answer to my question. Eleanor stood up abruptly, reaching for her purse. I think I should go. You're obviously not feeling well if you're making accusations like that. Sit down, Eleanor. Something in my voice must have convinced her that I wasn't asking. She sat back down but kept her purse in her lap. I know someone has been poisoning me, I said quietly. I have medical proof. I have toxicology reports showing arsenic in my system. Someone with regular access to my house has been slowly killing me for months. Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. That's horrible. Do you know who? I thought it was one of my sons, but yesterday I realized it couldn't be either of them. Why not? Because they love me. Because when I told them about the will change, their first concern was for my safety and their relationship with each other. A person who's been poisoning someone doesn't react that way to news that could affect their inheritance. Eleanor was very still, her hands gripping her purse tightly. So who do you think it is? Someone who would inherit everything if both Paul and Peter were out of the picture. Someone who has access to my house but doesn't visit often enough to be suspected. Someone who's bitter about the way their life turned out and sees my death as their last chance for financial security. Robert, you can't possibly think that I would... The activated charcoal. What? Peter figured out that someone was poisoning me, so he started putting activated charcoal in my food to absorb the toxins. But I kept getting sick anyway. Do you know why? Eleanor didn't answer, but I could see understanding and fear dawning in her eyes. because the poison wasn't in the food Peter prepared. It was in things I consumed every day, things that Peter's activated charcoal couldn't protect me from. My coffee, my vitamins, maybe even my toothpaste. You're paranoid. This is all speculation. No, Eleanor, this is evidence. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small recording device. Not one of Harold's sophisticated surveillance tools, just a simple voice recorder I'd bought at an electronics store. I've been recording this entire conversation, including the part where you admitted to having access to my house and using your key without my knowledge. Eleanor's composed mask finally slipped completely. That doesn't prove anything. Maybe not by itself, but combined with the toxicology reports, the timeline of my poisoning, and the financial motive you have for my death, it builds a pretty compelling case. Eleanor stood up again, this time moving toward the door. I'm leaving. If you want to make wild accusations, you can make them to your lawyer. Actually, my lawyer is already involved. As if on cue, Harold walked through my front door, followed by Detective Sarah Martinez and Officer Johnson. I'd arranged for them to arrive 30 minutes into my conversation with Eleanor, giving her enough time to incriminate herself. Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, Detective Martinez said, we have a warrant to search your home and your vehicle for evidence related to the attempted murder of your brother. Eleanor's face went completely white. She sank back into the chair, still clutching her purse. I want to see the warrant. Detective Martinez handed her the document. While Eleanor read it, I noticed Harold observing her carefully, taking notes on his legal pad. This is ridiculous, Eleanor said after reviewing the warrant. You can't possibly have evidence that I did anything wrong. We'll know soon enough, Detective Martinez replied. In the meantime, we'd like you to come to the station for questioning. Am I under arrest? Not yet. But we'd appreciate your cooperation with our investigation. Eleanor looked around the room, at me, at Harold, at the police officers. I could see her calculating her options, trying to figure out if she could still talk her way out of this situation. I need to make a phone call. I want a lawyer. That's your right. You can make that call from the station. As Detective Martinez and Officer Johnson prepared to escort Eleanor out of my house, she turned to look at me one last time. You have no idea what it's been like, she said, her voice filled with decades of resentment. Watching you have everything while I had nothing. The successful career, the beautiful wife, the loving sons, the money, the respect. Do you know what people say about me? Poor Eleanor, never married, no children, living alone in that little apartment. They pity me, Robert. They see me as a failure. So you decided to kill me. I decided to stop letting you have everything while I had nothing. You've had 72 good years. You've had love, success, family. What have I had? A series of dead-end jobs and an empty life. The bitter honesty of her confession was more chilling than any denial would have been. Eleanor wasn't sorry about trying to kill me. She was sorry about getting caught. What about Paul and Peter? I asked. Were you planning to frame them for my murder? Eleanor's expression became calculating again. I was planning to let them frame each other. Twin brothers fighting over an inheritance, one of them desperate enough to poison their father. The police would have assumed one was guilty, and the other was covering up for him. Eventually, they'd both end up in prison, and I'd inherit everything. And if that didn't work, then I'd have found another way to eliminate them from the equation. Harold looked up from his notes, his expression grim. Mrs. Harrison, you're confessing to conspiracy to commit murder. You might want to wait for your attorney before saying anything else. What's the point? Eleanor asked bitterly. You already know what I did. The only question is whether you can prove it. As it turned out, proving Eleanor's guilt was easier than any of us had expected. The search of her apartment revealed a cache of evidence that demonstrated months of careful planning. In her bedroom closet, police found detailed notes about my daily routine, my eating habits, and the times when Paul and Peter visited. She'd been stalking me, learning my patterns so she could time her poisoning attempts for maximum effect. In her kitchen, they found a bottle of arsenic-based ant poison that she'd been using to slowly kill me. The bottle showed evidence of repeated use, and chemical analysis confirmed it was the same compound found in my system. Most damning of all, they found Eleanor's computer, which contained extensive internet searches about arsenic poisoning, inheritance laws, and how to make deaths look natural. She'd researched everything from proper dosing schedules to symptoms that would mimic common age-related illnesses. Eleanor had also been keeping a journal documenting my decline, noting which methods of poison delivery were most effective, and planning how to increase the dosage without causing immediate death. She wanted you to suffer, Detective Martinez explained when she briefed me on their findings. This wasn't just about killing you for money. She wanted you to experience a long, painful decline that would rob you of your dignity and your enjoyment of life. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Eleanor suffered from what a psychiatrist called pathological envy, condition where resentment and jealousy become so consuming that they drive a person to extreme behaviors. Your sister has spent decades nurturing grievances against you. Dr. Patricia Wong explained to me after Eleanor's psychiatric assessment was complete. In her mind, every good thing that happened to you was something that was stolen from her. She genuinely believed that she was entitled to your life, your success, your family. Is she mentally ill? She has severe personality disorders, but she's legally sane. She knew what she was doing was wrong, and she made calculated decisions to commit crimes. This wasn't a psychotic break or a moment of temporary insanity. This was a deliberate, long-term campaign of attempted murder. 6 months later, Eleanor pleaded guilty to attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and elder abuse. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, essentially a life sentence for a woman her age. The judge's words during sentencing stayed with me for a long time afterward. Mrs. Harrison, your crimes were made more heinous by the fact that you violated the most basic bonds of family trust. Your brother loved you, trusted you, and gave you access to his home because he believed you cared about his well-being. You exploited that trust to slowly torture him to death. The court finds your actions reprehensible and your lack of remorse troubling. Eleanor showed no emotion during the sentencing. She sat quietly in her orange jumpsuit, occasionally glancing at Paul, Peter, and me in the gallery, but never showing any sign of regret or guilt. After the hearing, as we walked out of the courthouse together, Peter put his hand on my shoulder. Dad, I'm sorry we suspected each other. I should have realized sooner that the threat was coming from outside our immediate family. You figured it out eventually, I replied. That activated charcoal probably saved my life. Paul was quieter, still processing everything we'd learned about Eleanor's motivations and methods. Dad, I keep thinking about all those times she visited us when we were kids. All those family dinners, birthday parties, holidays. Was she always planning something like this? I don't think so, son. I think Eleanor's resentment built up over many years. Maybe if she'd gotten professional help earlier, if she'd found ways to build a fulfilling life for herself, things might have been different. Do you feel sorry for her? Peter asked. I thought about that question carefully. I feel sorry for the person she could have been. I feel sorry that she wasted her life on bitterness and envy instead of finding ways to be happy. But I don't feel sorry for the person who tried to murder me while pretending to care about my welfare. The recovery process took several more months. The chelation therapy gradually removed the arsenic from my system, and my strength slowly returned. Dr. Mitchell monitored my progress carefully, adjusting treatments as needed to repair the damage Eleanor's poisoning had caused. You're remarkably resilient for a man your age, she told me during one of my follow-up appointments. Most people wouldn't have survived 3 months of chronic arsenic poisoning, especially at the levels you were experiencing. What made the difference? Several things. You stayed physically active, which helped your body process the toxins more efficiently. You sought medical attention when you knew something was wrong, instead of just accepting illness as a normal part of aging. And your son's intervention, particularly Peter's activated charcoal strategy, probably prevented Eleanor from giving you fatal doses. A year after Eleanor's conviction, Paul and Peter threw me a party to celebrate my 73rd birthday. It was a small gathering, just family and a few close friends, but it felt like the most meaningful celebration of my life. Dad, Paul said during his toast, this year taught us all something important about family. Real family members protect each other, even when they're not sure who the threat is coming from. Fake family members exploit trust for their own benefit. To Robert, Peter added, raising his glass, who survived an attack that would have destroyed most people, and who taught us that love and loyalty are stronger than greed and resentment. As I looked around the room at the people who genuinely cared about me, My sons, their wives, my grandchildren, Harold, even Dr. Mitchell, who had joined us for the celebration. I realized that Eleanor's attempted murder had taught me something valuable. She'd been wrong about me having everything while she had nothing. Eleanor had always had the opportunity to build relationships, to find meaning and purpose in her life, to choose love over resentment. She'd had the same choices I'd had, the same opportunities to create connections with other people. The difference wasn't that I'd been given more than she had. The difference was that I'd chosen to invest in relationships while she'd chosen to nurture grievances. Paul and Peter had both been willing to suspect each other of murder when they thought it might be necessary to protect me. But ultimately, their love for each other and for me had led them to work together rather than against each other. Eleanor, on the other hand, had been willing to destroy her entire family to get money she didn't even need. "Dad," one of my grandchildren asked during the party, "why did Aunt Eleanor try to hurt you?" It was a question I'd been dreading, but also one I'd been thinking about for months. Sometimes, sweetheart, people get so focused on what other people have that they forget to appreciate what they have themselves. Aunt Eleanor looked at my life and only saw the things she didn't have. She forgot to look at her own life and see the things she could have been grateful for, but she could have just asked you for money if she needed it. You're absolutely right. She could have. But asking for help requires humility, and being grateful for help requires love. Aunt Eleanor had spent so many years being angry that she forgot how to be humble or loving. Later that evening, after the party had ended and Paul and Peter had gone home with their families, I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee, the same coffee that Eleanor had been poisoning for months, but which now tasted like freedom. I thought about the conversation Eleanor and I had never had, the one where she could have told me about her financial struggles, her loneliness, her feeling that life had passed her by. If she'd been able to set aside her pride and resentment long enough to be honest about her problems, I would have helped her. I would have given her money, helped her find better living arrangements, maybe even invited her to move closer so she could be more involved in family activities. But Eleanor had chosen murder over honesty, theft over humility, revenge over reconciliation. Now she was spending her final years in prison, while I was spending mine surrounded by people who loved me enough to fight for my life. At 73, I've learned that the most valuable inheritance you can leave your children isn't money. It's the knowledge that real family members choose to protect and support each other. Even when it's difficult, even when they're scared, even when they're not sure who to trust, Paul and Peter had chosen love over suspicion, cooperation over competition, and protection over self-preservation. That choice had saved my life and strengthened our family bonds in ways that will last for generations. Eleanor had chosen the opposite path, and it had led her to a prison cell and a legacy of betrayal. Today, 2 years after Eleanor's conviction, I'm healthy, happy, and surrounded by family members who prove every day that blood isn't always thicker than water, but love is always stronger than greed. And my will? I changed it back to the original version, splitting everything equally between Paul and Peter, because I learned that the sons who are willing to protect their father's life are also the sons who can be trusted with their father's legacy.